All right, so we're continuing where we left off, talking about how did the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment change the way Europeans think. And now we're beginning to talk about the Enlightenment and how were ideas about the government beginning to change. So if you look at this little picture here, you see the old ideas were focused on the king having all of the power and the power coming from the church. But now we see that the government is changing more to this idea of being more fair and equal and taking on the ideas of more people and not just being, I'm the king, this is what I say, and this is what goes. Because the ideas beginning to challenge the ideas of absolutism, the concept that absolute power corrupts absolutely. So what we're going to talk about today are some key thinkers of the Enlightenment that really changed the way people began to think. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau. Now, Hobbes was more of the idea of supporting absolute power. If you look at this slide here, it says the condition of man without control is a condition of everyone against everyone. So I want you to think for a second, what exactly does that mean? The condition of man without control is a condition of everyone against everyone. So thinking about that, what type of government would Thomas Hobbes be more supportive of? Would he be supportive of a democracy, or would he be more supportive of something that is more totalitarian? So if we look at these, who would agree with Hobbes? Now, we haven't really spoken that much about Machiavelli in class, but Machiavelli was a Renaissance author. He was a politician, and he writes on the state of the politics in Italy. His goal was actually to try to get Italy united. Ultimately, surprisingly, he wanted to have a republic for Italy. He wanted to bring back the idea of the Roman Republic to Italy. But he felt that until the various different city-states of Italy stopped fighting, got along, and were able to push out other countries like France and Spain that were constantly trying to meddle in Italian affairs, you needed a strong ruler, a strong prince, because Machiavelli writes a book called The Prince. So he says it's better to be feared than be loved. Machiavelli also says the ends justify the means. Now for him, the ends was a unified Italy. So whatever had to be done in order to stop the city-states from fighting each other and bring together a unified Italy. In the end, and we'll talk about this at another time, or if you're taking AP Euro, we'll talk about this a lot. In the end, he actually wanted a republic for Italy. But Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called The Leviathan. And Leviathan is a sea monster, basically. And the quote that's most associated with Thomas Hobbes is, life in the state of nature is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Here it said life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I've always heard as life in the state of nature is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And what he means by that is life without government. You need to have government create control for the people and stop the people from fighting, which goes back to that other quote that we talked about with Hobbes that says the condition of man without control, without government, is a condition of everyone against everyone. That it's just going to be chaos and everyone's just going to be fighting against each other unless there's some sort of order that's brought into society. And that's what you need government for, to create order in society. So I have here, we kind of said a lot of this already. People are naturally cruel, greedy, selfish. They need to give up their rights in order to have order. Now that's always contrasted with the ideas of John Locke. And if we look at this line here, it says, man being by nature all free and equal and independent, no one can be subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. Wherever law ends, tyranny begins. And tyranny is oppressive government. So man being by nature all free and equal and independent. No one can be subjugated. Subjugated means put below to the power of political government, to the political power of another without his own consent. So meaning that people give government permission to rule, and the government cannot take people's rights away without the people's own consent. So if we look at some other things that John Locke said, he said all men have certain natural rights, the rights of life, liberty, and property, which is very similar to what you look like here, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And hopefully, you might remember who said this, but we'll talk about who actually said this in a second. But we think about what Locke's saying, all men have certain rights, life, liberty, and property. These are things just by the nature of being alive and being a human being, we have the rights to. He also talks about the purpose of government is to protect these rights. So the government is supposed to protect our life, our liberty, and our property. So if we look at this quote, other quote says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That the people who are in the society gives permission to the government to rule. You got to hopefully this is starting to sound familiar. If it fails to do so, the people may set up a new government. So if the government is not protecting your rights, you're allowed to overthrow the government. So that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it's the right of the people to abolish it. So I hope you're thinking about somebody who might have said this. Hopefully if you remember back from 7th grade, because it's Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson definitely would have been reading Locke and would have used Locke's ideas to influence him as he was writing the Declaration of Independence. So Locke wrote the book, The Two Treatises on Governments. A treatise is like a political theory. People are basically reasonable and moral, as opposed to Hobbes, people are bad. People have natural rights, and the government must protect these rights. So, life, liberty, and land being property. Another major important thinker, Montesquieu. Now, Montesquieu was French. Locke and Hobbes were both from England. Montesquieu was French. He actually was he was from the aristocracy, so he was from the upper class. He was a baron. But he says there can be no liberty where the executive, legislative, and judicial powers are united in one person or body of persons, because such a concentration is bound to result in arbitrary despotism. So arbitrary means not limited by law. Despotism is a dictator, a tyrant, or what's known as an autocrat. So he's saying that all of the power of the government cannot be in the hands of one person. So hopefully that also sounds somewhat familiar to you, because in the United States, we of course have a separation of powers and checks and balances. That's why the president does not have control over the courts, and the president doesn't have control over all the laws. We have different branches of government to share this power. And it's Montesquieu that came up with this concept of the separation of powers, because he felt that it prevented any one person from gaining too much power. Now, the next guy we're going to talk about, who's one of my personal faves, his name is Voltaire, and this is actually my favorite quote from Voltaire. I do not agree with the word you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So what does this quote support? You might not agree with me, but I have the right to say it. So think about that. It is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. So think about, why might someone express this viewpoint? Voltaire actually spends time in prison for saying things like this. So what do you think he means by it's dangerous to be right when the government is wrong? Who's going to affect your freedom, or who's going to make your life dangerous? So Voltaire was a big admirer of freedom of speech. He admired China because he believed that China was being governed by secular scholars, meaning non-religious, meaning the scholar gentry. So Confucianism was more secular, it was more rational, and to him it felt more in place with enlightened ideas. Voltaire also was a great admirer of England, because he felt that England already kind of had these systems in place. And he, like Montesquieu, also believed that power should be shared. And he thought if you looked at England, you did start to see that separation of power. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking in class last week, talking about the creation of the Magna Carta and eventually the evolution of Parliament, and the idea that Parliament has the power of the purse strings. So that there was already this separation of power existent already in England. Another guy, Russo, the last one we're going to talk about. He said, man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. The government is created by a contract among the people and receives its power from them. So think about, who does this sound the most similar to? To Locke, to Montesquieu, to Voltaire, to Hobbes? Think about that. I would probably say Locke. This idea that the government is created by the contract among the people, receives its powers from them. It receives its power from these people. So Rousseau and Locke both talk about this concept of a social contract, that we agree to follow the government if the government agrees to protect our rights. So he talks about the social contract, giving up your interest for the common good. But the common good or the general will. The best way to describe it is, in this country we have elections. Everyone goes every 4 years, votes for the president. So say the person you voted for president does not win. You still have to respect that person as president because that person was still elected by the general will of the people. So it's not okay for you just to disobey a law or something the president says and be like, well, I don't have to listen to this guy or woman, I didn't vote for them. You can't do that. You have to submit to the general will. So here, just a quick recap of everybody's major ideas. Now the next question though becomes, how did the ideas of the Enlightenment spread? So there was many different ways that the ideas of the Enlightenment spread. The first one was that this is now the age of the printing press, and many books were being published, many pamphlets were being published because of the printing press. And we also start to see salons. Now a salon literally is basically like a living room in a house. So these salons would be not like a hair salon, would be informal social gatherings. So they were always run by women. So it actually was an instance in which women got rights in this system. So women would be called salonières. They'd be the ones who ran the salons. And they would invite various different writers, artists, philosophers to come together, and they would have these deep philosophical conversations. And that's how the ideas of the Enlightenment spread, through word of mouth, through gatherings in people's homes. So some other key Enlightened thinkers that we didn't really get into. One would be Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women. She argued that women deserved the same rights of men, and women need to be educated. Otherwise, they're basically enslaved. Diderot also published something called the Encyclopedia. Now, if you think about it, today you don't really have paper encyclopedias because we all use Google. But before Google, you would go to something called the Encyclopedia if you wanted to look up and gain general knowledge on things. And so this was a collection of knowledge, so everyone could become knowledgeable in many different areas. Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire all wrote articles for it. All different types of topics were included in the Encyclopedia. But I want you to think, if you're an absolute monarch during this time and you see that the ideas of these philosophers are spreading and becoming popular, what might you decide to do? Because you have a couple of options. You could become more cracking down on them and begin to censor these ideas, which some government leaders did, or you can begin to incorporate some of these ideas into your own government. So why did some of the European rulers embrace Enlightenment ideas? And so here we see, this is a picture of Voltaire hanging out with Frederick the Great in Prussia. So Frederick the Great in Prussia took Voltaire in when Voltaire was basically kicked out of France for his ideas. And Frederick the Great was a very respected person who was very willing to take on Enlightened ideas to a certain degree. One other thing to say about Frederick the Great is, very famously, his table in his house was a round table, which meant there was no one at the head. Usually, if the king was sitting, the king would be at the head of the table and everyone would have to kind of defer to them. But Frederick the Great didn't do that. He sat at a round table, let everyone kind of be able to speak their mind and feel equal. So Catherine the Great of Russia was another despot or ruler who liked to consider themselves enlightened. She had a whole bunch of correspondence with people like Voltaire and Diderot. Actually, Diderot comes to Russia to visit. So enlightened means new ideas, and despot means dictator. So in some ways, it's kind of an oxymoron, but basically some of these absolute rulers decided to adopt Enlightenment ideas in order to be able to maintain support of the people. So this term, the enlightened despot, was an absolute ruler who used their power to bring about political and social change. So if we look here at the three major rulers who were considered enlightened despots at the time: Frederick the Great of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Joseph II of Austria. So you could see here they all had elements that were enlightened. Some of them tolerated religion, some of them had academies of science, some of them helped their peasants, Some gave their people more rights, but they also kind of did not allow any opposition and forced the people to accept these changes. So they were enlightened, but not 100%. So I want you to think finally of the ideas of the scientific revolution, of the ideas of the Enlightenment. In your opinion, are these ideas really what we would consider to be a revolution?